Hello guys, today I want to cover just how accurate the Iberian Peninsula is in Europa Universalis 4. And I also want to go into a bit of detail to understand the situation in Iberia during the 15th century. And I'm telling you now, it wasn't pretty. So having done a few regions in EU4 like Europe and Africa, I thought I'd go into one that's a bit more historically impactful, and if I'm honest, probably one of the more important regions in Europa Universalis 4. Some examples of this are firstly, when we look into Castille, a few decades after the start date of EU4, they were led by the Habsburgs, which let's just say they weren't the best looking family you would see, and were known for this really pointed chin. And they were probably one of the most important dynasties throughout Europe for centuries to come. So why is Castille so powerful in game, and how did the Habsburgs use Castille's power in order to become so important? Also, I've always wondered, and you've probably always wondered, why is Granada the last surviving Muslim state? And you've kind of got to wonder, why has it lasted so long, given the fact it's just surrounded by all these powerful Christian kingdoms? You know, what makes it so unique? Why is it still alive? Which we will also discuss in this video. Finally, one of the most important reasons why Iberia has such a historical impact on the world is because of the colonisation and exploration aspect of it. When we look at Portugal, they don't seem so powerful at the start of the game, but 40 years after the start date of EU4, they are one of the first nations that really drive colonisation and really push outside their comfort zone. After we go into some of the backgrounds of these nations, I also want to discuss just how historically accurate the Iberian Peninsula is. I'd just like to say, for most of the regions I've covered, the Iberian Peninsula really is very accurate, so good job to Paradox on that. But we have missed a few interesting nations, which we'll discuss later in this video. Now, last time we spoke about Ulm, I'd said we'd go to a nightclub in Ulm and ask the DJ to play some Europa Universalis 4 music. Some of you actually quite liked that idea, but then I thought of an even better one. What if we go to the Old Minster, bribe the organist a few ducats, and then he starts playing Europa Universalis 4 music? I think that would personally be quite a sight to behold. So if you want to see that happen, make sure to click that button, so we can get to 100,000 subscribers and go to Ulm. So let's go to the southern peninsula of Iberia, and first talk about Granada in EU4, and delve into a bit of the background of this nation. When it first began in the 13th century, Granada had a really cunning leader known as Muhammad I. He was someone who really understood the politics at the time, and knew he needed to make good political alliances in order for his state to survive. He therefore pledged loyalty to Castille, and despite their differences, they did get on for a short amount of time. With the mountainous natural border you can see in game, Castille just didn't think it was worth their time going to Granada and taking it, and wanted to focus on their other enemies, so they allowed Granada to survive. As the decades went on, however, the relationship between Castille and Granada took a turn for the worst, and Granada, feeling ambitious and bold, decided to attack Castille with the help of Morocco. The historic battle between the Muslims and Christians in the Iberian Peninsula took place in 1340, and this would be a historical moment for both sides. Despite the Granadan and Moroccan forces outnumbering Castille 3-1, the Muslims had a disastrous battle, and the Christians came out on top. And it's why, at the start date of EU4, the Iberian Peninsula is predominantly Christian. So after this battle, maybe Granada could have come back with the weakness of Castille, but it was just not to be. And Granada had its own internal problems. You see, within Granada there were clans, and most of these clans chose clan loyalty over the emir loyalty. And so within the state, most people were really divided, and it meant they fought themselves rather than thinking of the big Christian power of Castile. In EU4, we do always see Granada get wiped out as well. So I'm now going to talk about how this is historically accurate in game. One event in 1469 that pretty much seals Granada's fate is the Iberian Wedding, which is a political marriage between Aragon and Castille, and this unification between the two kingdoms meant that they were a European superpower, and simply could not be stopped on the Iberian Peninsula. In the late 15th century, Castille wanted to unite the Iberian Peninsula under their banner, and so when some of the Granadan clans attacked the Castilian villages, they had a good reason to attack Granada. The Castilian campaign into Granada was fairly swift, and Granada didn't really put up a good fight. The emir simply couldn't unite the clans to fight Castille, and eventually, after a while, Granada surrendered. It was also noted that when Granada did surrender, the emir's mother said to him, "You weep like a woman for what you can't hold as a man," which is definitely a bit of roasting, and pretty much sums up what exactly the emir did, which is nothing. and so that's why you see in game all the time Granada collapse. I think definitely though, it adds quite a good gameplay, just like Byzantium when it collapses to the Ottomans. In game, Granada is definitely represented well, and from the event spawning to just dying really quickly, it all makes historical sense, and I think Paradox have done a good job in just showing that. You could argue that the borders between Granada and Castille are a bit different from how they were historically, but then again it's a game and it just doesn't really matter. There's nothing I don't think that I would particularly add to Granada at the moment, but if you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. I now want to move on to Portugal, and from what I can see in game, it's given quite a lot of flavour, which is crucial because it's one of the most important nations at the time. We also see right at the start of the game that Portugal is allied to England, and believe it or not, this is probably one of the most important historical allies for the Iberian Peninsula, and actually enables Portuguese survival. This alliance goes back to the 12th century, when some crusaders literally just rocked up and decided to help Portugal against the Muslims. When the alliance takes a more serious turn though, is in the 1350s, when France and Castille both ally with each other. And as you can imagine, England was not happy with this at all, and so they did decide to ally Portugal to make sure there was a balance of power in Western Europe. Just before the start date of EU4, there was also a really important conflict, and Castille wanted to take over Portugal in the late 14th century. The significant battle between Portugal and Castille took place in 1385, and England decided to send troops over in order to help Portugal win that battle. And with this historical battle, Portugal did win, and it meant that they were able to remain independent, despite the significant threats from Castille. I also like just how historically accurate Portugal is represented in game. Another important thing to note in Portugal's background is their colonisation and exploration stuff. And so in game, when you play Portugal, and they're so focused on colonisation and exploration, the reason is because of this man, Henry the Navigator, who establishes a naval base and a school of exploration. Henry the Navigator inspired and established loads of navigation trips, and meant the generations after him also followed suit, and explored the world to find better trade routes, because the Ottoman Empire were charging extortionate prices for the Ottoman spice trade. Now one historical inaccuracy I can say with Portugal is when we look at the border between Portugal and Castille, one of the provinces that is Castilian is actually Portuguese, and it's known as Olivenza. This province, although it's owned by Spain today, is very much still heavily disputed by Portugal, and Portugal doesn't actually recognise Spain's sovereignty. This is the biggest inaccuracy of Portugal, as far as I can tell. Moving on to Castille and Aragon, I think I've already said enough about these nations already, but it's quite clear these were the two big superpowers of the Iberian Peninsula, and really got involved with the politics of Europe. Around the time of EU4 in the 15th century, Castille and Aragon definitely did contribute. I would say in terms of their history, Castille and Aragon are definitely well represented in game as well. There is however a potential map inaccuracy of Castille. Now a map inaccuracy of these two nations is how do you interpret them on a map? I actually don't believe Paradox should make any changes to it, but it's still interesting to talk about the constituent kingdoms, which have a bit of autonomy and you can see them on the map. The only potential thing you can change about Castille are the BK lordships. The lordships were a part of the Castilian kingdom, but they maintained a high amount of autonomy, so maybe they could be represented as vassals in game. I personally also wouldn't change anything about Aragon, and they look good how they are. The last nation I want to talk about is Navarra, which is a nation state between France and Castille, and consequently has a lot of ties to these two big nations. I'd say the demise of this kingdom occurred in 1441, when the Aragonese effectively took over the throne, and didn't allow the next rightful Navarran king to become leader. Given the fact Navarra almost always becomes a vassal of one of the nations surrounding it, I'd say this is very historically accurate. Now we've touched on the historical background and accuracies of Iberia, what nations did Paradox miss out? And to be honest with you, they haven't really missed out that many nations, and most of them are microstates. First one we're going to talk about, which I'm sure most of you know, is Andorra, which would be situated between Aragon and France in game. It was first created by King Charlemagne as a buffer state to keep the Muslims out. However, I wouldn't say they did anything significant during this time. Having said that, the government type is rather interesting, and they have this sort of unique government, where Spain and France both have a leader there. So that would be quite interesting to represent them in game, when you have these two leaders. Another microstate is Count Misto, which is situated between Portugal and Galicia. Now, to put this into context, this place has literally 3 villages, so it is very insignificant, but they pretty much ruled themselves, and had the right to bear arms and take political refugees from the nations surrounding it. Although it shouldn't be added into vanilla EU4, maybe they could add it into some sort of EU4 mod, and you could play as this rogue village republic, smiting down the mighty Portugal and Castille. The final microstate I want to talk about is Palau Sabia, which is next to Andorra. This is probably the most active out of all the microstates I've talked about, but yet again, it's still really insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And ultimately, although these 3 microstates are really interesting in some way, I just don't think it's worth Paradox adding these into the game. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and found out a bit more about the Iberian Peninsula. Shout out to Dodo Lulu Pepe for helping make this video. Thank you guys for watching, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.